Hi guys, it's Miss Portillo. Today we're going to be starting a novel study over one of my favorite books, which is A Wrinkle in Time. It is a chapter book, so I'm reading it to my fourth grade students, some higher level third grade students, and definitely fifth grade students. With the outbreak and the rapid evolution of the coronavirus, COVID-19, it's hard to obviously get back into the schools right now. So we as teachers are all, of course, having to make changes and adaptations in order to get that learning to our students. The expectations are not as high because the students' expectations should be reasonable. They are at home. We are not able to teach them in the classroom anymore. So I'm going to be starting a novel study over this book, and what we should be looking for today are the plot elements. So we start with our exposition, which is going to tell us our setting and our main characters. Setting can, of course, change throughout the book, as well as the characters, the changes the characters undergo. We're going to be looking for our rising action elements. So the rising action, one thing that confuses my students is they think that it's just the problem. But it's not just the problem, but the build-up or the evolution of problems throughout the rising action. So character doesn't just start with one problem, climax, finishes the problem and resolves it, but there can be several things that build up to that problem. Otherwise, it would probably be a very short book. So we're going to try to get through most of chapter 1 today. If you have been annotating in your school or taking notes, we're going to be taking notes about the tone or the mood that the story starts with, main ideas and main characters, important things, and definitely our plot elements. So at the very least today, we'll get to see our setting and the tone of the story as it starts and learn a little bit about some of our main characters. It is a chapter book, so I can't show you the pictures, but I'm happy to read it to you, and I'll post a video at least once a week trying to, until the novel study is complete, to get the book completed, and I hope you enjoy it. Chapter 1, Miss What's It? So another thing I tell my students is to look for unfamiliar words and decode them. So the words might have prefixes or suffixes, and having a knowledge of that, along with your phonetic knowledge and your syllabication, will help you to decode what the word means. You're also going to look for context clues in the sentence or the paragraph. And I have my students write those words down, go back later and try to decode them, and then confirm with a resource such as a dictionary. Some books like this one might have some nonsense words that are a little bit harder to decode because they're not real words. They're part of the author's craft and made up by the author. But you could still use your context clues to try and figure out what those words mean. So that's what we're going to try to do today as we get through this first chapter. It was a dark and stormy night. In her attic bedroom, Margaret Murray, wrapped in an old patchwork quilt, sat in the foot of her bed and watched the trees tossing in the frenzied lashing of the wind. Behind the trees, clouds scudded frantically across the sky. Every few moments, the moon ripped through them, creating wraith-like shadows that raced along the ground. The house shook. Wrapped in her quilt, Meg shook. She wasn't usually afraid of weather, but it's not just the weather, she thought. It's the weather on top of everything else. On top of me. On top of Meg Murray doing everything wrong. School. School was all wrong. She'd been dropped down to the lowest section of her grade. That morning, one of her teachers had said crossly, "Really, Meg, I don't understand how a child with parents as brilliant as yours are supposed to have such a poor student. If you don't manage to do a little better, you'll have to stay back next year." During lunch, she roughhoused a little, trying to make herself feel better, and one of the girls had said scornfully, "After all, Meg, we aren't grammar school kids anymore. Why do you always act like such a baby?" And on the way home from school, walking up the road with her arms full of books, one of the boys had said something about her dumb baby brother. At this, she'd thrown the books on the side of the road and tackled him with every ounce of strength she had, and arrived home with her blouse torn and a big bruise under one eye. Sandy and Dennis, her 10-year-old twin brothers, who got home from school an hour earlier than she did, were disgusted. "Let us do the fighting when it's necessary," they told her. "A delinquent, that's what I am," she thought grimly. That's what they'll be saying next. Not mother, but them. Everybody else. I wish father... It was still not possible to think about her father without the danger of tears. Only her mother could talk about him in a natural way, saying, "When your father gets back." Get backs from where? And when? Surely her mother must know what people were saying, must be aware of the smugly vicious gossip. Surely it must hurt her as much as it did Meg. But if it did, she gave no outward sign. Nothing ruffled the serenity of her expression. Why can't I hide it too? Meg thought. Why do I always have to show everything? The window rattled madly in the wind, and she pulled the quilt closer about her. Curled up on one of her pillows, a gray fluff of kitten yawned, showing its pink tongue, tucked its head under again, and went back to sleep. Everybody was asleep. Everybody except Meg. Even Charles Wallace, the dumb baby brother, who had an uncanny way of knowing when she was awake and unhappy, and who would come so many nights, tiptoeing up the attic stairs to her. Even Charles Wallace was asleep. How could they sleep? All day on the radio there had been hurricane warnings. How could they leave her up in the attic in the rickety brass bed, knowing that the roof might be blown right off the house, and she tossed out into the wild night sky to land who knows where? Her shivering grew uncontrollable. You asked to have the attic bedroom, she told herself. Mother let you have it because you're the oldest. It's a privilege, not a punishment. Not during a hurricane it isn't, she said. She tossed the quilt down on the foot of the bed and stood up. The kitchen stretched luxuriously and looked up at her with huge, innocent eyes. Go back to sleep, Meg said. Just be glad you're a kitten and not a monster like me. She looked at herself in the wardrobe mirror and made a horrible face, bearing a mouthful of teeth covered with braces. Automatically, she pushed her glasses into position, ran her fingers through her mouse-brown hair so that it stood wildly on end, and let out a sigh almost as noisy as the wind. The wide wooden floorboards were cold against her feet. Wind blew in the crevices about the window frame, in spite of the protection the storm sash was supposed to offer. She could hear wind howling in the chimneys. From all the way downstairs, she could hear Fortinbras, the big black dog, starting to bark. He must be frightened too. But what was he barking at? Fort never barked without reason. Suddenly, she remembered that when she had gone to the post office to pick up the mail, she'd heard about a tramp who was supposed to have stolen 12 sheets from Miss Buncombe, the constable's wife. They hadn't caught him, and maybe he was heading for the Murray's house right now, isolated on a back road as it was, and this time, maybe he'd be after more than sheets. Meg hadn't paid much attention to the talk about the tramp at the time, because the postmistress, with a sugary smile, had asked if she heard from her father lately. She left her little room and made her way through the shadows of the main attic, bumping against the ping-pong table. Great. Now I'll have a bruise on my hip on top of everything else, she thought. Next she walked into her old doll's house, Charles Wallace's rocking horse, the twins' electric trains. Why must everything happen to me? She demanded of a large teddy bear. At the foot of the attic stairs, she stood still and listened. Not a sound from Charles Wallace's room on the right. On the left, her parents' room. Not a rustle from her mother sleeping alone in the great double bed. She tiptoed down the hall and into the twins' room, pushing against her glasses, as though they could help her see better in the dark. Dennis was snoring. Sandy murmured something about baseball and subsided. The twins didn't have any problems. They weren't great students, but they weren't bad ones either. They were perfectly content with a succession of B's and an occasional A or C. They were strong and fast runners and good at games. And when cracks were made about anybody in the Murray family, they weren't made about Sandy and Dennis. She left the twins' room and went on downstairs, avoiding the creaking seventh step. Fort had stopped barking. It wasn't the tram this time, then. Fort would go on barking if anybody was around. But suppose the tramp does come. Suppose he has a knife. Nobody lives near enough to hear if we screamed and screamed and screamed. Nobody'd care, anyhow. I'll make myself some cocoa, she decided. That'll cheer me up. And if the roof blows off, at least I won't go off with it. In the kitchen, a light was already on, and Charles Wallace was sitting at the table drinking milk and eating bread and jam. He looked very small and vulnerable sitting there alone in the big old-fashioned kitchen, a blond little boy in faded blue Dr. Denton's, his feet swinging a good 6 inches above the floor. Hi, he said cheerfully. I've been waiting for you. From under the table where he was lying at Charles Wallace's feet, hoping for a crumb or two, Fort raised his slender dark head in greeting to Meg, and his tail thumped against the floor. Fort had arrived on their doorstep, a half-grown puppy, scrawny and abandoned, one winter night. He was, Meg's father had decided, part Llewellyn setter and part greyhound, and he had a slender dark beauty that was all his own. "Why didn't you come up to the attic?" Meg asked her brother. "I've been scared stiff." "Too windy up in that attic of yours," the little boy said. "I knew you'd be down. I put some milk on the stove for you. It ought to be hot by now." How did Charles Wallace always know about her? How could he always tell? He never knew, or seemed to care, what Sandy and Dennis were thinking. It was his mother's mind and Meg's that he probed with frightening accuracy. Was it because people were a little afraid of him that they whispered about the Murray's youngest child, who was rumored to be not quite bright? "I've heard that clever people often have subnormal children," Meg had once overheard. "The two boys seem to be nice, regular children, but that unattractive girl and the baby boy certainly aren't all there." It was true that Charles Wallace seldom spoke when anybody was around, so that many people thought he'd never learn to talk. And it was true that he hadn't talked at all until he was almost 4. Meg would turn white with fury when people looked at him and clucked, shaking their heads sadly. "Don't worry about Charles Wallace, Meg," her father had once told her. Meg remembered it very clearly because it was shortly before he went away. There was nothing the matter with his mind. He just does things in his own way and in his own time. "I don't want him to grow up to be dumb like me," Meg had said. "Oh, my darling, you're not dumb," her father answered. "You're like Charles Wallace. Your development has to go at its own pace. It just doesn't happen to be the usual pace." "How do you know?" Meg had demanded. "How do you know I'm not dumb? Isn't it just because you love me?" "I do love you, but that's not what tells me. Mother and I have given you a number of tests, you know." Yes, that was true. Meg had realized that some of the games her parents played with her were tests of some kind, and that there had been more for her and Charles Wallace than for the twins. "IQ tests, you mean?" "Yes, some of them." "Is my IQ okay?" "More than okay." "What is it?" "That I'm not going to tell you, but it assures me that both you and Charles Wallace will be able to do pretty much whatever you like when you grow up to yourselves. You just wait till Charles Wallace starts to talk. You'll see." How right he had been about that, though he himself had left before Charles Wallace began to speak, suddenly, with none of the usual baby preliminaries, using entire sentences. How proud her father would have been. "You'd better check the milk," Charles Wallace said to Meg now, his diction clearer and cleaner than that of most 5-year-olds. "You know you don't like it when it gets a skin on top." "You put in more than twice enough milk." Meg peered into the saucepan. Charles Wallace nodded serenely. "I thought Mother liked some." "I like what?" a voice said, and there was their mother standing in the doorway. "Cocoa," Charles Wallace said. "Would you like a liverwurst and cream cheese sandwich? I'd be happy to make you one." "That would be lovely," Miss Murray said, "but I can make it myself if you're busy." "No trouble at all." Charles Wallace slid down from his chair and trotted over to the refrigerator, his pajamaed feet patting softly as a kitten's. "How about you, Meg?" he asked. "Sandwich?" "Yes, please," she said, "but not liverwurst. Do we have any tomatoes?" Charles Wallace peered into the crisper. "One. All right if I use it on Meg, Mother?" "To what better use could it be put?" Miss Murray said. "But not so loud, please, Charles. That is, unless you want the twins downstairs, too." "Let's be exclusive," Charles Wallace said. "That's my new word for the day. Impressive, isn't it? Meg, come let me look at that bruise." Meg knelt at her mother's feet. The warmth and light of the kitchen had relaxed her so that her attic fears were gone. The cocoa steamed fragrantly in the saucepan. Geraniums bloomed on the window sills, and there was a bouquet of tiny yellow chrysanthemums in the center of the table. The curtains, red with a blue and green geometrical pattern, were drawn, and seemed to reflect the cheerfulness throughout the room. The furnace purred like a great, sleepy animal. The lights glowed with steady radiance. Outside, alone in the dark, the wind still battered against the house. But the angry power that had frightened Meg while she was alone in the attic was subdued by the familiar comfort of the kitchen. Underneath Miss Murray's chair, Fort let out a contented sigh. Miss Murray gently touched Meg's bruised cheek. Meg looked up at her mother, half in loving admiration, half in sullen resentment. It was not an advantage to have a mother who was a scientist and a beauty as well. Mrs. Murray's flaming red hair, creamy skin, and violet eyes with long dark lashes seemed even more spectacular in comparison with Meg's outrageous plainness. Meg's hair had been passable as long as she wore it tidily in braids. When she went into high school, it was cut, and now she and her mother struggled with putting it up. But one side would come out curly and the other straight, so she looked even plainer than before. "You don't know the meaning of moderation, do you, my darling?" Miss Murray asked. "A happy medium is something I wonder if you'll ever learn." "That's a nasty bruise the Henderson boy gave you. By the way, shortly after you'd gone to bed, his mother called up to complain how badly you'd hurt him. I told her that since he's a year older and at least 25 pounds heavier than you are, I thought I was the one who ought to be doing all the complaining. But she seemed to think it was all your fault." "I suppose that depends on how you look at it," Meg said. "Usually, no matter what happens, people think it's my fault, even if I have nothing to do with it at all. But I'm sorry I tried to fight him. It's just been an awful week, and I'm full of bad feelings." Mrs. Murray stroked Meg's shaggy head. "Do you know why?" "I hate being an oddball," Meg said. "It's hard on Sandy and Dennis, too. I don't know if they're really like everybody else, or if they're just able to pretend they are. I try to pretend, but it isn't any help." "You're much too straightforward to be pretending to be what you aren't," Miss Murray said. "I'm sorry, Meglet. Maybe if Father were here, he could help you. But I don't think I can do anything till you've managed to plow through some more time. Then things will be easier for you. But that isn't much help right now, is it? Maybe if I weren't so repulsive looking. Maybe if I were pretty like you." "Mother's not a bit pretty. She's beautiful," Charles Wallace announced, slicing liverwurst. "Therefore, I bet she was awful at your age." "How right you are," Miss Murray said. "Just give yourself time, Meg." "Lettuce on your sandwich, Mother?" Charles Wallace asked. "No, thanks." He cut the sandwich into sections, put it on a plate, and set it in front of his mother. "Yours will be along in just a minute, Meg. I think I'll talk to Miss Whatsit about you." "Who's Mrs. Whatsit?" Meg asked. "I think I want to be exclusive about her for a while," Charles Wallace said. "Onion salt?" "Yes, please." "What's Mrs. Whatsit stand for?" Miss Murray asked. "That's her name," Charles Wallace answered. "You know the old shingled house back in the woods that the kids won't go near because they say it's haunted? That's where they live." "They?" "Miss Whatsit and her two friends. I was out with Fort a couple of days ago. You and the twins were at school, Meg. We'd like to walk in the woods. And suddenly he took off after a squirrel, and I took off after him. And we ended up by the haunted house. So I met them by accident, as you might say." "But nobody lives there," Meg said. "Mrs. Whatsit and her friends do. They're very enjoyable." "Why didn't you tell me about it before?" Miss Murray asked. "And you know you're not supposed to go off our property without permission, Charles." "I know," Charles said. "That's one reason I didn't tell you. I just rushed off after Fort without thinking. And then I decided, well, I'd better save them for an emergency anyhow." A fresh gust of wind took the house and shook it, and suddenly the rain began to lash against the windows. "I don't think I like this wind," Meg said nervously. "We'll lose some shingles off the roof, that's for certain." "But this house has stood for almost 200 years, and I think it will last a little longer. There's been many a high wind up on this hill. But this is a hurricane," Meg wailed. "The radio kept saying it was a hurricane." "It's October," Miss Murray told her. "There have been storms in October before." As Charles Wallace gave Meg her sandwich, Fort came out from under the table. And that's where I'm going to stop right there for today. I do want to take a quick minute to discuss the book and the plot. So today we definitely heard about the first setting in the story. So our exposition, again, is our setting and our main characters. And we've started to hear quite a bit of our rising action. So we've started with our problems and our main characters. So Meg, obviously a main character, we've heard about several issues that she's having. And again, I want you to think about not just one main problem, try to figure it out right away. I want you to think about and list the several problems that it seemed like Meg was focused on, the several things that were seeming to go wrong in her life, so that we can take one of those later and say, well, this is the main problem in the story. Because even though we've gotten through most of the first chapter, we still might not have heard the main problem yet. This is all our rising action because this is all building up to the problem. Okay? And also, I hope you got the tone or the mood at the beginning of the story, even though they went back and forth between Meg's thoughts and what her family members were saying to her. It still kept going back to that same tone, that same mood, and we're going to discuss that next time. Okay, I started on page 1 and it ended on page 20. So that's all that we are going to work on today. I'd also like you to try and figure out the point of view that the story's in until I get back to you next time. Next time we'll go over your notes and I'll discuss them with you. So feel free to leave me anything in the comments or ask me any questions. Have a good day. Stay safe.